In today's video, we are looking at the most popular graphics card on Steam, which isn't brand new, so let's go ahead and see how it does in the latest games. At 1080p, 1440p, will it play with graphics settings, DLSS, all of that. What graphics card is it? The RTX 3060. It has the top spot on the Steam hardware survey, and it's ahead of cards like the 1650, which is certainly going to be a lot weaker than that 3060, but then you got cards like the 3060 Ti, 2060, 3070, 1060. The 3060 laptop GPU pops in as well, but we're looking at the 3060. Now there is well, not new, but newer version of the 3060 that got cut down to 8 gigabytes of VRAM. That's not the 3060 we're looking at in this video. We are looking at the original 12 gigabyte RTX 3060, and we're gonna see how it's doing in the latest games. Can you play at good frame rates in the latest titles? Well, let's start with Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p resolution, and if you drop down from the very high settings, which give you about 59 frames per second, to the high settings, you get 76 frames per second, giving you a 29% performance boost, and things are going pretty well. If you want to play at 1440p resolution, I tried very high settings, and medium settings, and I noticed that we could get a 40% performance boost by going down to medium, which gets us 60 FPS at 1440p native resolution. No upscaling, none of the DLSS or any of that. But again, it was playable at very high and high. It just was hitting 60 FPS on medium settings. However, if you want to keep the settings higher, but you're going to use upscaling to boost the frame rate, you can actually stay at the very high graphics settings and play at 60 frames per second, or again, using DLSS quality. And then you can also go up to the down to the high settings to boost frame rate to 76 frames per second, getting a 27% performance boost. So you can actually get a very good experience in Ghost of Tsushima at both 1080p and 1440p and a variety of graphic settings. Now, this game also features frame generation, and I'm actually going to pause here to talk a little bit more carefully about frame generation. So one of the things about the 30 series, and really any series of NVIDIA products before the 40 series, is that they don't support DLSS frame generation. However, AMD's FSR does support frame generation. So what I'm doing right here is we're looking at what if you use frame generation off versus frame generation on, and we're using FSR's frame generation, but I'm also using DLSS upscaling. It's a little bit unfortunate that these technologies, DLSS, frame generation, and upscaling are under the same umbrella, that same kind of word, whereas the upscaling renders the game at a lower rendering resolution and tries to make it look like the native resolution. So our DLSS quality here is rendering the game below 1440p and then trying to reconstruct a 1440p output at a higher frame rate than you get at a native 1440p. Frame generation does something completely different. That takes 2 frames and slightly delays showing you one in order to use some optical flow analysis and figure out what would happen in between. It inserts that frame in between, which gives you more motion fluidity on the screen, but doesn't improve responsiveness the way that actually just running the game at a higher frame rate normally would. Meaning that when you're running this with frame generation off and you're getting about 60 frames per second, and then frame generation on, and we're jumping up to 95 frames per second, the responsiveness will still feel pretty similar to where you were at with 60 frames per second, but the motion fluidity on your screen will look more like 95 frames per second. Now, DLSS frame generation isn't supported on anything below the 40 series. However, FSR 3 frame generation, which again is kind of under that annoying umbrella where again their frame generation is also under the same branding as their upscaler, FSR 3 does work on pretty much any GPU, any modern GPU, including the 3060. And what's cool with the latest release of FSR 3.1 is that they've decoupled the upscaling from the frame generation, so we're able to use DLSS upscaling, which generally has better image quality than FSR upscaling, but then still use FSR frame generation in order to get frame generation on this card. And you can see that it's working very well to boost the motion fluidity. Again, don't judge motion fluidity by what you see in this video, though, because this video is a locked 60 frames per second YouTube. It's not variable refresh rate. You can't see high refresh rates or any of that. So you have to kind of trust the frame time graph and the numbers that I'm showing you over here, that it is increasing the fluidity of the experience. Now let's move on to Unreal Engine 5, the most A visually impressive Unreal Engine 5 game so far is Hellblade 2, and at 1080p, if you want to get a 60 FPS experience at native 1080p resolution, although it's really black barring part of it, so it's not even a full 1080p, you have to go down to the low graphic settings. But let's also talk about that for a second here, because in a lot of these games, we're going to be looking at turning down the graphic settings. But like, if you played PC games for a long time like I have, you used to see games where the low settings were just like a potato mode that looked absolutely terrible. Look at the low settings in this game, and I will challenge you to find, games from very recent AAA games where their ultra settings looked as good as these low settings. Because honestly, again, low is a word. It is the lowest setting available, but it is extremely good looking still, and it's getting you over 60 FPS. And it's a 70% frame rate boost from the high settings, where we were only hitting 37 frames per second here. So anyway, just wanted to make sure we understand that yes, it's low settings, but it still looks quite good, even up against the high settings. Now, if you try to go to 1440p resolution, even down at the low settings, we're only hitting 44 frames per second. Now, I'll also mention, though, that this particular game is very slow-paced, so you can definitely enjoy it at 44 frames per second, especially if you're playing on a controller rather than a keyboard and mouse, where I find the lower frame rates are a bit more tolerable. So if you have a variable refresh rate display, not a terrible experience. However, Unreal Engine 5 responds extremely well to upscaling. The engine and most of its big features do seem to be kind of designed with upscaling in mind. And if you kick on DLSS quality, we can see that at medium settings, you can actually hit 58 FPS average here, and at low settings, DLSS quality, you can hit 68 frames per second average. And even high settings with DLSS quality hits 41 FPS average, which again, I wouldn't want to play in a fast-paced shooter, but in this style of game could be perfectly acceptable. If we move on to Horizon Forbidden West, we can see that at 1080p resolution, even the very high settings are just slightly under 60 FPS. The high settings don't do a lot to boost performance because I think they're mostly designed to pull VRAM usage down, but the 12 gigabytes on our 3060 wasn't having any issue anyway. And the medium settings give us a nice 46% performance boost over very high, getting us an 82 FPS average here at 1080p. And again, medium settings do look quite good in this game. If we move up to 1440p resolution, then the medium settings are getting us 59 FPS, so pretty good experience here, even at native 1440p resolution. And that's a pretty good performance boost, 44% higher than the performance at very high settings, which we're hitting 41 FPS. And again, the high settings not getting a big performance boost here, because like I said, I think they're mostly designed to pull down the VRAM usage under 8 gigabytes. If we kick on DLSS quality on top of these different graphic settings, we can see that very high settings, 1440p DLSS quality, is actually close to 60 FPS. If you have a variable refresh rate display, you're probably pretty happy here. But if you want a higher refresh rate experience, medium settings with DLSS quality is a 41% performance boost over very high DLSS quality, hitting 79 FPS average. And even the 1% lows are at 70, so very smooth experience. Another huge new visual showcase type game is Alan Wake 2. Now this one is a bit rough. So I actually did have to try out using DLSS quality. So we're looking at high native 1080p, high with DLSS quality, and then low settings. And here the low settings didn't give a huge boost over high settings, but using DLSS quality gave a pretty good performance boost, hitting 55 FPS average. This is another pretty slow-paced game where I think you would actually be happy with that experience if you had a variable refresh rate display. At 1440p resolution, the low settings only get us 35 FPS, the high settings at 28. That is a 25% performance boost, but that's not a massive performance boost. So really, I mean, you could play this game around 30 FPS because again, it's very slow paced. However, I think most people would want to kick on some DLSS. I found that if I went down to the balanced mode on DLSS off of the low preset, we could average around 60 FPS. Here I'm averaging 59 in this test. Notice the 1% lows still go down into the 40s because in the more heavily forested areas, the game gets particularly demanding. But much of this game would be running at or above 60 FPS using low settings DLSS quality. And again, this is another game where the low settings still look quite good. Another of the newer graphic showcase type experiences is Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. And if we look at 1080p resolution, ultra settings are only hitting 35 FPS. Dropping to medium gets us to 52, and dropping to low is 57, which is a 63% performance boost over the ultra settings. So that's pretty close to 60 FPS. You're probably having a pretty good time. Now, if we move up to 1440p resolution, ultra settings only hit us at 23 FPS. Dropping all the way down to low settings does bring us up to 39 frames per second, which is a 70% boost over the ultra settings. But 39 FPS, well, this game's more of a first-person shooter style combat, so unlike Hellblade 2 and Alan Wake 2, where I think you could probably be pretty happy around 40 FPS, I think this is one where I would definitely chase a higher refresh rate experience. And so I kicked on DLSS balanced on the high settings, and that got us 56 FPS. DLSS balanced on the medium settings gets us to 63 FPS, and if you want to use less aggressive upscaling, you could go down to the low graphic settings and use DLSS quality, and that could get you to 64 frames per second. So that's several ways that you could achieve around a 60 FPS experience at 1440p in one of the most graphically demanding and beautiful new games. If we go to Resident Evil 4 Remake at 1080p resolution, the max settings hit 64 FPS, but I'm going to be honest, if you go down to the prioritized graphics, which turns down the ray traced reflections, which don't look that great anyway, the game still looks great, and you're actually hitting 110 frames per second here, which I think is well worth it, and you're getting a very nice, smooth experience. If we go up to 1440p resolution, the max settings hit 49 FPS, but again, the prioritized graphics preset, which is the second highest preset, just like I said, turns off some grainy looking RT reflections, keeps most settings very high or near their highest settings, and you get a 63% performance boost hitting 80 FPS here. So even at native 1440p at prioritized graphics, you're having a great experience. Now, Starfield, on the other hand, the ultra settings at 1080p hit 40 FPS. If the high settings don't do a whole lot of performance boost, if you go down to the medium settings, which we're looking at here, you do get to around 60 FPS at 1080p in this new Atlantis area that I'm testing here. So 58 FPS average. If you go down to the low settings, the game just looks absolutely terrible. So I wouldn't want to go down below those medium settings. If we go up to 1440p, we can see that the ultra settings are averaging around 31, and the medium settings get us a 42% performance boost, hitting 44 frames per second. Now, other areas of the game do run better than this, so it's possible some people could just hit medium settings and, in the more demanding areas be in the 40s, and in a lot of the easier areas still be closer to 60. However, I think a lot of people would like to kick on DLSS to get a performance boost here. If we do that off of the ultra settings, we can hit 40 frames per second. But if we use the medium settings as our baseline to then use DLSS quality, that actually gets us to 60 frames per second. So you still get a pretty reasonable looking game at medium settings here, although I've got to say, when you look at the other games and the graphics they had on offer compared to the similar performance we're getting here, I will say Starfield doesn't feel to me like it's justifying its graphical workload on the GPUs. Here I'm looking at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, where, quite frankly, I think a lot of people just use their PC to play, multiplayer games, and they do it at low graphic settings, like here we're at the basic settings, and you're getting a very good experience here. 152 FPS at 1080p, 109 FPS at 1440p, so pretty good experience there. Now, let's pop out for my final thoughts. Actually, the 3060 kind of surprised me here. I expected it to do well at 1080p in the latest games, in 2024 with compromised settings, and it did. What actually really surprised me is how well we could still do at 1440p resolution if we're willing to use DLSS quality. And honestly, DLSS, the image quality has been getting, steadily updated over time. And in the vast majority of games, I do find that DLSS quality at 1440p looks close enough to native resolution that given the performance boost you're able to get off of it, I really do think it's helping cards like the RTX 3060 age particularly well. Especially because the 3060 has that 12 gigabytes of VRAM, where you've seen in some of my recent testing that 8 gigabyte cards do sometimes struggle at graphics settings they could otherwise have handled. whereas the 3060 isn't really running into any of those issues. Now, you're still having to turn down some graphics settings. The other thing I'll mention on that is that, you know, in this video, I'm just using graphics presets where we're turning a bunch of things down altogether. In reality, with that 12GB VRAM buffer, the 3060 could usually keep a lot of settings at their maximum that are not super compute dependent, but are more VRAM dependent, like textures, which can often make a big visual difference in games. It's nice that the 3060 is going to be able to keep these games playing at their maximum texture settings. Whereas in games like Horizon Forbidden West, for example, I've seen the 8GB cards can't handle the very high settings, even at 1080p resolution without stutters. So it's really nice that on a card like this, maybe you're not going to be at the very high settings at 1440p, but maybe you could go down to medium settings, but keep the textures up at their maximums, which is really nice. 1080p resolution, you know, we can do even better. There was a couple games that were a bit more of a struggle, especially games like Alan Wake 2, where we're not quite hitting that nice 60 FPS in the more demanding areas, but that also tends to be a slower paced game. So, I mean, the 3060, I think, has aged pretty well for what it is. Now, at a lot of points in time, you could have bought other GPUs for a similar price, like the 6700 XT from AMD, which is probably aging, you know, even better with its additional power. And a lot of times those were actually at a similar price point. So I'm not trying to say, you know, talk about whether this was the right GPU to buy. I was just curious, okay, a lot of people have this thing. So, you know, game developers targeting performance, you know, are people wrong to hang on to this? And like I said, I think it did very well. Also, again, what I was mentioning right here at the end is I really do think, especially when you look at the popular cards on Steam, especially noticing that cards like the 1650 and the 2060 and the 1060 are still on here. Those aren't super powerful cards. However, if you're playing the more like esports titles, you're playing CSGO, Rainbow Six Siege, you're playing, you know, League of Legends, Dota. If you're playing basically competitive games where you're going to turn down the graphic settings anyway, and they might already not be super demanding, then I think cards like this are definitely powerful enough. You can see that we're doing very well here. And like I said, even in the more demanding new games out here, I think you're getting a very playable experience. So pretty cool to see, I think, how well the 3060 is aging. Another test I'd like to look coming out on the channel, or we'll see what order I end up publishing this in, but I think I'll publish this one first. I also want to look at the 4060 in these same tests, because that's interesting, because the 4060 is a bit more powerful, and it is newer, but it also only has 8GB of VRAM. So I'm really curious, how does the 3060 stack up against the 4060 in this same series of tests? Just to kind of see how does the 8GB but more power do against 12GB but less power. So stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in that. Huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, commenters, especially channel members who have clicked the join button down there to directly support the channel financially. That is a huge help, and totally understand that not everybody can do that, but in return, I do give thanks in the form of like membership badges on your comments, and they're easier for me to find and reply to. Members get some behind the scenes content that doesn't make sense on the main channel feed, but you do get some members videos for behind the scenes stuff, early access to some videos. Like, for example, I think this video is probably going to be an early access video because I got other stuff coming in the meantime. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. I found it useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.